There is a list of names that should not exist in the order they do. For centuries, they were treated as simple labels, passed from father to son, village to village, a quiet inheritance that meant nothing more than, this is who your family has always been. But when geneticists began comparing the men who carry these ancient Slavic surnames against the deep genomic record of Eastern Europe, something did not line up. Not the surnames themselves. What was hiding underneath them? Because a surname is supposed to be a story about culture. What the DNA suggested instead was a story about migration, conquest, and forgetting, one written not in parish records, but in the Y chromosome itself, passed silently from father to son for over 1,000 years, largely undisturbed by the noise of history above it. This is the story of what happened when researchers stopped reading Slavic surnames as folklore and started reading them as evidence. For most of modern history, the accepted account of Eastern Europe's population was tidy, almost reassuring in its simplicity. Historians and linguists described a broad, Slavic homeland, somewhere in the marshes and forests between the Vistula and Dnieper rivers, from which a single cultural and linguistic wave expanded outward in the 6th and 7th centuries. This wave, the story went, swept across a vast territory, from the Elbe in the west to the Volga in the east, from the Baltic coast down into the Balkans, carrying language, custom, and eventually surnames along with it. Surnames themselves, when they emerged centuries later, were assumed to simply follow that same current. A name rooted in an old Slavic word for wolf, for smith, for a particular trade or geographic feature, was treated as a marker of straightforward Slavic descent. The logic seemed sound. Language spreads with people. Names spread with language. Case closed. It was a clean, linear story. Populations moved, settled, and named themselves according to what they were. For a long time, no one had a reason to question it. But there was a problem historians noticed long before geneticists arrived, and it never quite fit. Some of the oldest Slavic surnames, especially those tied to specific clans and noble lineages in Poland, Bohemia, and the Balkans, carried linguistic fragments that did not cleanly resolve into common Slavic roots. A handful echoed older Iranian-speaking steppe vocabulary. Others seemed to preserve traces that scholars associated with Germanic or even Turkic contact. Populations this single homeland, single wave model had no comfortable place for. Oral tradition added its own static. In parts of the Balkans, family lore describing ancestors as newcomers from the mountains or descendants of horsemen sat uneasily beside surnames that linguists had confidently filed under purely agrarian Slavic vocabulary. Something about the neat migration model kept snagging on details that refused to smooth over. For decades, these anomalies were treated as noise, interesting footnotes, not structural problems. Then genetics entered the conversation, and noise became signal. The first tool researchers turned to was the Y chromosome, the piece of DNA passed almost unchanged from father to son, generation after generation, making it a remarkably durable proxy for surname lineages, which in most of Europe also followed the paternal line. If a surname had a genuinely unified Slavic origin, the men carrying it today should cluster tightly around a small number of related Y chromosome lineages, all tracing back to a relatively recent, relatively localized ancestral population. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited only through mothers, offered a second and very different lens, one less tied to surnames, but powerful for tracking older population movements and revealing whether male and female ancestry told the same story or two different ones. And behind both of these sat the newer, far more powerful tool, autosomal, whole genome analysis. Where Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA trace single threads, autosomal data reads the entire tapestry, every ancestral contribution, from every branch of a family tree, going back thousands of years. It does not just ask who was his father's father's father. It asks what proportions of ancient populations, steppe pastoralists, early European farmers, hunter-gatherers, and later migratory groups, a person's entire genome actually contains. When researchers ran these tools against men carrying some of the 15 oldest documented Slavic surnames, clan names and patronymics with roots stretching back to early medieval records, the results did not simply confirm the single homeland story. They complicated it. If you are drawn to stories where the evidence quietly rewrites the map, this is a good moment to subscribe, because Eastern Europe's genetic history turns out to be one of the most tangled and least told chapters in the human story. Some surname lineages did cluster exactly where the old model predicted, tracing back to Y chromosome haplogroups strongly associated with the early Slavic expansion out of the region north of the Carpathians. That part of the story held up. But other lineages, carrying names just as old and just as Slavic on paper, told a different story entirely. Their Y chromosome signatures pointed toward populations with much deeper roots in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the same broad region associated with earlier Bronze Age pastoralist migrations, thousands of years before anyone spoke a Slavic language at all. Still others carried Y chromosome markers more closely tied to Baltic or Finno-Ugric populations to the north, populations the traditional story treated as separate neighbors, not ancestral contributors. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. The story did not collapse. It widened. What had looked like a single wave of Slavic-speaking farmers spreading uniformly across Eastern Europe was beginning to look like something closer to a slow, uneven confluence. Multiple older populations, already present across the region, gradually absorbed into an expanding Slavic linguistic and cultural identity rather than replaced by it. Researchers began proposing several frameworks to explain the pattern, and none of them canceled the others out. The first was straightforward admixture. As early Slavic-speaking communities expanded from their core territory, they did not move into empty land. They moved into regions already populated by Baltic tribes, remnants of earlier Iranian-speaking steppe groups, and scattered Germanic populations left behind by earlier migrations. Intermarriage and cultural absorption over generations would blend these populations genetically, even as language and surname practice shifted decisively toward Slavic norms. The second framework pointed to something researchers sometimes call a ghost population, a genetic contributor visible in the data through its statistical fingerprint, but without a clean modern or ancient reference sample to match it to directly. Several of the older, more geographically isolated surname lineages carried genomic segments that did not match neatly onto any well-documented ancient population, suggesting an unsampled, possibly localized group that contributed ancestry without leaving an obvious archaeological trace. The third framework was cultural absorption without full genetic replacement, the idea that in certain regions, Slavic language, naming customs, and social structures spread primarily through elite influence and cultural prestige, adopted by existing local populations who changed how they spoke and named their children far faster than their underlying ancestry changed at all. Each of these explanations was plausible. None of them, on its own, accounted for every surname lineage tested. That, researchers began to suspect, was the point. Eastern Europe's population history was not one process. It was several layered on top of each other over more than 2,000 years. The moment that shifted the conversation from theory to evidence came with a large-scale genomic comparison, one that combined whole genome data from modern surname carriers with an expanded panel of ancient DNA samples recovered from early medieval and Iron Age burial sites across Poland, Ukraine, and the Balkans. This was not a small, isolated study. It drew on a far larger and more geographically dispersed sample than earlier surname-based research had managed, and for the first time it allowed researchers to directly compare living lineages against the actual ancient populations who once occupied the same ground. The results were more decisive than anyone expected. Several of the oldest surname lineages, ones long assumed to represent pure, early Slavic ancestry, showed a measurable and statistically significant genetic affinity not with early medieval Slavic period skeletal remains, but with much older Iron Age populations from the same territory, populations who predated the Slavic linguistic expansion by centuries. The DNA had not simply confirmed that these families were Slavic. It suggested they were something older, wearing a Slavic name. The twist was not that these families had mixed ancestry. Almost every population in human history does. The twist was where that older signal pointed. Not toward a neighboring Slavic-speaking group. Not toward Baltic or Germanic populations sitting conveniently next door, as the earlier admixture theories had assumed. In several of the tested lineages, the strongest ancient affinity traced back toward populations associated with steppe-adjacent, semi-nomadic groups from well outside the traditional Slavic homeland, a signal more consistent with early Iranian-speaking or para-Iranian steppe communities that genetics researchers usually associate with sites much further southeast. In other words, some of the oldest, most culturally Slavic surnames in Eastern Europe may sit atop lineages whose deepest ancestral roots trace not to Slavic-speaking farmers at all, but to steppe horsemen who arrived, settled, and were quietly absorbed into a linguistic identity that came later and outlasted whatever they had originally called themselves. The genome was not erasing the Slavic story. It was revealing an older one beneath it. This matters far beyond 15 family names. It suggests that ethnic and linguistic identity in Eastern Europe, and arguably everywhere, is not a straight line traced backward from a modern nation to a single ancestral population. It is a palimpsest. Layer after layer of migration, absorption, intermarriage, and cultural reinvention, each one partially overriding the last without ever fully erasing it. The old model imagined history as a river with one clear source. What the DNA suggests instead is something closer to a delta, many separate streams from many separate origins, converging, mixing, and eventually becoming difficult to tell apart, even though each one is still there, in trace amounts, in the genome of every descendant. It also complicates a temptation that has haunted the history of Eastern Europe for over a century, the idea that a surname, a language, or a national identity maps cleanly onto a single, ancient, unbroken genetic population. It does not. It never has. Not here and not almost anywhere else on Earth. Populations moved, merged, separated, and transformed continuously long before anyone was writing any of it down. Picture, for a moment, the landscape where this story actually unfolded. Not a map, not a chart of haplogroups, the ground itself. The wide, slow rivers of the Polish lowlands, silted and patient, moving through birch and marsh toward the Baltic. The rolling steppe grasslands further east and south, where wind moves through grass the way it moves through nothing else on the continent, and where a rider on horseback could once cover in a season what a farming village might not cover in a generation. The dense, dark interior forests of the Carpathian foothills, where isolated communities held on to older customs long after the languages around them had changed twice over. Somewhere in that landscape, 1,000 years ago or more, a man who spoke a language we might barely recognize took a name for his trade, his clan, his village, his father, and passed it to his son. He could not have known that name would still be spoken a millennium later, in a country whose borders did not yet exist, carried by a descendant who would one day spit into a vial not to confirm who he was, but to discover who his ancestors actually were, long before that name existed at all. He was Slavic, in every way that mattered to the people who knew him. And beneath that identity, quietly preserved in a chromosome that does not care about language or nationality, was something older still, a fragment of a people history had mostly forgotten, riding along silently inside a name meant to describe something else entirely. That is what these 15 surnames ultimately reveal. Not fraud. Not a false identity. Something more interesting than either, proof that identity itself has always been layered, provisional, and built on top of older identities that came before it, absorbed rather than erased. The map of Eastern Europe's ancestry was never as simple as one homeland and one wave. It was never going to be. Human populations do not move like that, and they never have. If there is a lesson in this, in 15 names, in a handful of Y chromosome lineages, in one large and carefully constructed genomic study, it may be this: every surname is a story someone chose to tell about themselves. The genome, patient and indifferent, simply keeps telling the older stories underneath it, whether we asked it to or not. The mystery was never really solved. It was only made larger, older, and more honest than the version we started with. And somewhere in that expansion is the entire point, that the deeper we look into where we come from, the less any of us turn out to be a simple, single thing. If this kind of buried history interests you, let me know in the comments which population or surname lineage you would want uncovered next, because there is a great deal more still hidden in the human past than most of us have been told.